Folks, before we get started today, I want you to walk down Fantasyland with me. I want you to join me in imagining an Africa that works for all Africans. Imagine there are no boundaries holding us back in Africa. Imagine there is nothing to kill or die for. Imagine there are no crooks dividing and conquering us and brainwashing us, whether they're in Africa or from foreign lands. To borrow from John Lennon's song Imagine, why don't I conclude this intro with the chorus from Imagine and say to you, ooh, you may say I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. I hope someday you join us and Africa would be a better place. Hello everybody. Once again, this is Fred Wanko coming to you from our studios in Chicago with another edition of Bold Talk on Island TV. And as usual, I like to say good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to you depending on where you are around the world. Africa will be a better place when we create an environment that enables our young people, especially the Gen Z, to be able to fantasize and dream about what Africa can be. And Africa can really be every bit of that and more if we just create the enabling environment. And it's on that note that I decide to bring you a video today about the silent revolution that's going on in Africa. But it's still lost on Nigeria, because in Nigeria we have a puppet that's working with our enemies instead of working with other Africans to build what Africa can be. This video that I'm bringing you is for the most part AI, but it's an AI production that definitely fills the gap for everything we're looking for in Africa and more. I want you to kick back, relax, but for the most part, please share this video. Share it with your children. After all, it's their future that is at stake. Just ignore me, but send it to the young people. I know that our generation is a lost cause, but let's give our children a chance to live in a place that works.
Tonight, we reveal how a calculated move to weaken one man accidentally strengthened an entire continent, and why global powers are now scrambling to undo what they've done. The morning sun cast long shadows across the corridors of the United Nations headquarters in New York as diplomats hurried through marble hallways, their faces etched with concern. In less than 24 hours, they would make a decision that would backfire spectacularly, creating the very outcome they were desperately trying to prevent. The air conditioning hummed softly in Conference Room 2046, a nondescript meeting, space tucked away on the 20th floor of the UN building. Unlike the Grand Assembly Hall where cameras captured world leaders addressing humanity, this room was designed for conversations that would never see daylight. The heavy oak table reflected the worried faces of 5 men who represented some of the world's most powerful nations. Ambassador Richardson from the United States adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses as he studied the classified intelligence report spread before him. The document, stamped with red letters reading "Eyes Only," contained detailed analysis of Ibrahim Traoré's recent activities that had alarmed Western capitals from Washington to Paris. "Gentlemen," Richardson began, his voice carrying the weight of years spent in diplomatic corridors, "we have a problem. Traoré isn't just another African strongman we can manage with the usual playbook. His anti-colonial rhetoric is spreading like wildfire across the continent." The French representative, Ambassador Dubois, leaned forward, his manicured fingers drumming against the polished wood. "The situation in Burkina Faso has moved beyond our comfort zone. Traoré's nationalization of gold mines has cost our companies billions. But that's not the worst part." He paused, letting the gravity of his words settle. "He's inspiring copycat movements across Francophone Africa." Ambassador Chen from China remained silent, his expression unreadable as he processed the Western anxiety. Unlike his colleagues, he saw opportunity where they saw threat. China's Belt and Road Initiative had been gaining ground in Africa precisely because leaders like Traoré offered alternatives to traditional Western partnerships. The intelligence reports are clear, continued Richardson, pulling out satellite photographs showing large crowds gathered in Ouagadougou's central square. These aren't just political rallies, they're anti-Western demonstrations with very specific messaging. Traoré is calling for complete economic independence from former colonial powers. Ambassador Petrov from Russia smiled slightly, unable to hide his satisfaction at Western discomfort. Perhaps, he suggested with practiced diplomatic restraint, the solution isn't to punish Traoré, but to understand why his message resonates so strongly with African populations. Understanding him isn't our job, snapped Dubois, his diplomatic composure cracking slightly. Stopping him is. The man is systematically dismantling decades of carefully constructed relationships. Last month he expelled our military advisors. This month, he's renegotiated mining contracts that were ironclad. If we don't act now, we'll lose the entire Sahel region. The British representative, Ambassador Thompson, had remained quiet throughout the exchange, studying intelligence photographs with the intensity of a chess master planning several moves ahead. There's something else, he said finally, his crisp accent cutting through the tension. Our sources indicate Traoré has been in secret communication with other military leaders across West Africa. Mali's Goïta, Niger's Tiani. They're coordinating. Richardson felt his stomach tighten. Coordination among African leaders was exactly what Western powers had worked for decades to prevent. How reliable is this intelligence? Extremely. Phone intercepts, financial transaction analysis, movement patterns of key personnel. They're building something, and it's specifically designed to challenge Western influence in the region. The room fell silent except for the distant hum of New York traffic 20 floors below. Each man understood the implications. If Traoré succeeded in creating a unified bloc of anti-Western African states, it wouldn't just affect mining rights or military bases. It would represent a fundamental shift in global power dynamics. The proposal on the table, Richardson said, opening a thick folder marked with the UN seal, is comprehensive targeted sanctions, personal asset freezes for Traoré and his inner circle, travel bans, arms embargoes, and most importantly, restrictions on international banking relationships for Burkina Faso. Dubois nodded approvingly. The goal is isolation. Cut him off from international finance, make it impossible for him to travel and build alliances. Demonstrate to other African leaders that challenging the established order has severe consequences. And if it backfires? Asked Petrov, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. It won't, Thompson replied with British certainty. African leaders are pragmatic. When they see Traoré isolated and his economy collapsing, they'll distance themselves. No one wants to be on the wrong side of international law. The vote was swift and decisive. 4 nations in favor, 1 abstention from China. Within hours, legal teams were drafting the sanctions package. Intelligence agencies were preparing supporting documentation, and diplomatic channels were being activated to ensure swift passage through the Security Council. None of them noticed Ambassador Chen's subtle smile as he gathered his papers, or the encrypted message he would send to Beijing that evening. The West is about to make their biggest mistake in decades. Prepare to capitalize. The decision was made. The trap was set. What none of these experienced diplomats realized was that they had just lit the fuse on a powder keg that would explode in their faces, creating exactly the unified African resistance they were trying to prevent. The presidential palace in Ouagadougou stood majestically against the morning sky, its white walls gleaming in the intense African sun. Built during the colonial era but thoroughly reimagined by independent Burkina Faso, the building represented a blend of African architectural heritage and modern governance. Palm trees lined the circular driveway where government vehicles arrived. and departed with the steady rhythm of a functioning democracy. Inside his private office, Ibrahim Traoré sat behind a desk carved from local hardwood, its surface polished to mirror-like perfection. At 36 years old, he possessed the commanding presence that had made him a continental icon. But this morning, his usual confidence was tempered by the gravity of the news his aide had just delivered. "Mr. President," said Colonel Ouedraogo, his chief of staff, placing a leather folder on the desk with ceremonial gravity. "The UN Security Council has passed Resolution 2847, Comprehensive Sanctions against Burkina Faso, effective immediately." Traoré opened the folder, his trained military mind quickly processing the legal language that would reshape his country's international relationships. Asset freezes, travel bans, arms embargoes, banking restrictions. It was a textbook isolation strategy designed to strangle his government's ability to function on the global stage. "They're trying to make an example of us," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of understanding. "Show other African leaders what happens when you challenge the established order." "Sir, there's something else. Phone calls have been coming in since the news broke. Presidents from across the continent. They're not distancing themselves." Traoré looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" President Diomaye Faye from Senegal called personally. "Said his government doesn't recognize the legitimacy of sanctions against sovereign African nations." President Félix Tshisekedi from DRC sent a private message through encrypted channels. Even President Akufo-Addo from Ghana, despite his country's strong Western ties, expressed private concerns about the precedent this sets. The phone on Traoré's desk buzzed insistently. Colonel Ouedraogo glanced at the caller ID and his eyes widened. "Sir, it's President Ramaphosa from South Africa. Direct line." Traoré picked up the phone, switching to English. "Cyril, my brother." The familiar voice of South Africa's president came through clearly, warm but serious. "Ibrahim, I'm calling to let you know that what happened today at the UN is not sitting well with many of us down here. The African Union is convening an emergency session. I appreciate your support, but I don't want other nations to suffer consequences for standing with Burkina Faso. That's exactly the mentality we need to change," Ramaphosa replied firmly. "For too long we've allowed fear of Western retaliation to keep us divided. Maybe it's time to show the world that Africa can stand together." After the call ended, Traoré walked to the large window overlooking Ouagadougou's bustling streets. Street vendors sold colorful fabrics, children played football in dusty lots between buildings, and the normal rhythm of African urban life continued unchanged. These people had no idea that their young president had just become the target of international isolation designed to bring his government to its knees. What the sanctions architects hadn't calculated was the deep well of continental frustration that had been building for decades. Every unfair trade agreement, every imposed structural adjustment program, every time African resources left the continent only to return as expensive manufactured goods, had added to a collective anger that was ready to explode. Colonel Ouedraogo returned with updates that defied every prediction the UN strategists had made. "Sir, President Touadéra from Central African Republic just announced his government will not comply with sanctions against a fellow African nation. President Bayo from Sierra Leone made a similar statement. This is unprecedented." "They're not afraid anymore," Traoré realized, a smile slowly spreading across his face. For the first time in decades, African leaders are choosing continental solidarity over Western approval. The phone rang again. This time it was Colonel Goïta from Mali, his voice crackling with energy over the secure line. "Ibrahim, my brother, I'm boarding a plane to Ouagadougou right now. We need to talk face to face." "Assimi, you don't need to risk..." "Risk what? Being sanctioned for supporting my neighbor? Let them try. Niger's Tiani is flying in tomorrow. It's time for a different kind of summit, As the sun set over Ouagadougou, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples that seemed to match the fire of continental awakening, Traoré understood that the UN's calculated punishment had become something else entirely. A rallying cry for African independence that would reshape the continent's relationship with the world. What do you think about this incredible turn of events so far? Are you surprised by how quickly African leaders rallied around Traoré? Or did you see this continental awakening coming? Let us know in the comments what you think will happen next. The VIP terminal at Ouagadougou International Airport buzzed with unprecedented activity as security teams coordinated the arrival of multiple African heads of state. What had started as spontaneous expressions of support was rapidly evolving into the most significant gathering of Pan-African leaders in decades, all happening away from the glare of international media. Colonel Assimi Goïta's aircraft touched down first, the Malian flag prominently displayed on the fuselage of the modest government jet. Unlike the luxury aircraft typically associated with African leaders' international travel, this plane was functional, almost Spartan, reflecting the military efficiency of its passenger. Goïta emerged wearing his characteristic military fatigues, his bearing radiating the confidence of a man who had already survived Western pressure and emerged stronger. General Abdourahmane Tiani arrived 3 hours later from Niger. His delegation, including key members of his National Council for the Safeguard of the Homeland. The two military leaders had coordinated their visits, understanding that their public solidarity with Traoré would send shockwaves through Western diplomatic circles. But the real surprise was yet to come. In the presidential palace's main conference room, normally used for formal state functions, Ibrahim Traoré had arranged a meeting that would have been unthinkable just weeks earlier. The room's African art and traditional textiles created an atmosphere that was distinctly continental, far removed from the sterile conference rooms where African leaders typically met with their former colonial masters. "Brothers," Traoré began, as the three leaders settled into chairs arranged in a circle rather than the hierarchical rectangles favored by Western diplomacy. Yesterday's sanctions were meant to isolate Burkina Faso. Instead, they've exposed something the international community didn't expect: Africa's readiness to stand together. Goïta leaned forward, his weathered hands clasped together. "Ibrahim, what happened to you could happen to any of us tomorrow. Mali's relationship with France has already deteriorated beyond repair. Niger is facing similar pressures. We're already living under the threat of Western displeasure. The question," added Tiani, his voice carrying the measured tone of a strategist, "is whether we respond defensively or take the initiative. For too long, we've allowed outsiders to set the terms of engagement. Maybe it's time to write our own playbook." The conversation was interrupted by Colonel Ouedraogo, who entered with an encrypted communication device. "Mr. President, we have secure calls from presidents who couldn't travel here but want to participate in this discussion." Within minutes, the small circle had expanded to include President Paul Kagame from Rwanda, participating via secure video link, his sharp intellect evident even through the digital connection. President Macky Sall from Senegal joined by phone, despite his country's traditionally strong ties to France. Most surprisingly, President Uhuru Kenyatta from Kenya had requested to be included, bringing East African perspective to what had begun as a West African solidarity movement. "Gentlemen," came Kagame's crisp voice through the speakers, "what we're witnessing isn't just about sanctions against Burkina Faso. It's about whether Africa will continue to accept being treated as a collection of client states, or finally assert itself as a continental power." The discussion that followed would later be described by participants as the most honest conversation between African leaders in decades. Without the usual diplomatic niceties required in international forums, they addressed the fundamental question that had haunted the continent since independence. How could Africa break free from neo-colonial relationships that kept it economically dependent despite its vast natural wealth? "The alliance of Sahel states we've been discussing," Tiani said, referring to previous conversations between Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, needs to expand. Not just military cooperation, but economic, integration, political coordination, unified positions in international forums. Sal's voice carried both excitement and caution through the phone connection. Mackie here. I support the principle, but we need to be strategic. Some of us are dealing with democratic institutions that require careful management of international relationships. Which is exactly the problem, interjected Goita. Too many of our institutions were designed by outsiders to keep us dependent. Real independence requires being willing to bear short-term costs for long-term sovereignty. The real breakthrough came when Kagame proposed something that stunned even these experienced leaders. What if we stopped thinking defensively? Instead of just resisting Western pressure, what if we created our own mechanisms, our own development, bank, our own trade agreements, our own security arrangements, make ourselves so economically integrated that sanctioning one of us means sanctioning all of us? The room fell silent as the implications sank in. This wasn't just about supporting Traoré against unfair sanctions. They were discussing the creation of genuine African autonomy, the kind of continental integration that had been discussed for decades but never seriously implemented. Traoré felt the weight of history in that moment. Brothers, what we're discussing here could change everything. Not just for our generation, but for our children and grandchildren. Are we ready for that responsibility? The responses came without hesitation. Yes from Mali. Yes from Niger. Yes from Rwanda, Kenya, and Senegal. One by one, as other leaders joined the conversation throughout the evening, a consensus emerged that would have been impossible just days earlier. By midnight Ouagadougou time, the framework for the most significant African political realignment since independence had been outlined. They would call it the Continental Sovereignty Initiative, and its first action would be a coordinated response to the UN sanctions that had inadvertently catalyzed African unity. Thank you so much for staying with us through this incredible journey so far. Your engagement means everything, and believe us when we say the best is yet to come. What we've seen is just the beginning of a story that will reshape not just Africa, but global politics as we know it. The news of the secret Ouagadougou summit spread across Africa faster than any official communication network could have managed. In an age of social media and encrypted messaging apps, the continent's youth had created their own information channels, and they were buzzing with excitement about what their leaders were finally doing. In Lagos, Nigeria's commercial capital, university students at the University of Lagos organized what they called a sovereignty rally in support of Traoré and the emerging African alliance. The massive gathering in the campus amphitheater drew thousands of young Africans who had grown up watching their continent's resources leave for foreign shores while they struggled with unemployment and limited opportunities. For the first time in our lives, shouted Amina Cohn, a 22-year-old political science student, her voice carrying across the packed amphitheater, we're seeing African leaders choose Africa over foreign approval. This is our independence moment, the crowd erupted, in cheers, many holding homemade signs reading Africa First, and sanctions won't stop sovereignty. Social media exploded with hashtags like Yash Africa United, Dash Traoré Effect, and Sovereignty Now, each trending across multiple African countries simultaneously. But it wasn't just the youth. In markets from Dakar to Dar es Salaam, conversations were dominated by the unprecedented show of African unity. Market women who had watched decades of political promises disappear into corruption and foreign interference found themselves cautiously optimistic about leaders who seemed willing to risk international isolation for continental solidarity. The real surprise came from an unexpected source: the African diaspora. In Brooklyn, New York, Dr. Kwame Asante, a Ghanaian-American professor at Columbia University, received a call that would change everything. It was from his cousin in Accra, a businessman who had been following the developments with intense interest. "Kwame, something is happening here that you need to understand," his cousin said, excitement evident in his voice despite the poor connection. "The youth are organizing like I've never seen. They're calling it the Continental Awakening. But it's not just protests. They're creating networks, sharing resources, building the kind of Pan-African connections that Nkrumah dreamed about." Dr. Asante had spent his academic career studying African political movements, but what his cousin described sounded different from the usual activism. This was organic, decentralized, and spreading faster than any government could control or co-opt. "They're using technology to do what politicians have talked about for decades," his cousin continued, "connecting African students across borders, sharing strategies for economic independence, even creating their own cryptocurrency for intra-African trade. The Traoré sanctions didn't just unite governments, they awakened something in the people. The awakening manifested differently across the continent. In South Africa, mining unions declared their support for resource nationalism, inspired by Traoré's success in renegotiating foreign mining contracts. In Kenya, tech entrepreneurs began discussing the creation of an African alternative to Western financial systems. In Ghana, traditional chiefs, usually careful to stay out of politics, began speaking publicly about the need for true African independence. The most dramatic demonstration came from an unexpected place: the African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. Dr. Amira Hassan, a senior economist at the AU Commission, had watched the developments with professional interest that gradually transformed into personal excitement. She had spent 15 years working within the system, trying to promote African integration through official channels, often frustrated by the slow pace of change and the constant interference from outside powers. The Emergency African Union session, called in response to the UN sanctions, became the largest gathering of African heads of state in the organization's history. 34 presidents and prime ministers attended in person, with others participating virtually. The agenda was simple: how should Africa respond to the precedent set by sanctioning a member state for pursuing sovereign policies? Colleagues, President Ramaphosa addressed the assembly, his voice carrying the weight of moral authority earned through decades of struggle. "We face a defining moment. Do we continue to accept that our sovereignty is conditional on foreign approval, or do we finally claim the independence our liberation movements fought for?" The response was unprecedented. One by one, African leaders rose to declare their non-recognitions of sanctions against Burkina Faso. But more than that, they began announcing concrete steps toward continental integration that had been discussed for decades but never implemented. President Kenyatta announced that Kenya would withdraw from bilateral trade agreements that prioritized European access over African integration. President Tshisekedi declared that the Democratic Republic of Congo would begin preferential treatment for African companies in mineral extraction contracts. President Bayo announced Sierra Leone's support for an African monetary union independent of foreign currencies. But the most powerful moment came when President Kagame, participating virtually from Kigali, made an announcement that stunned even his fellow leaders. Rwanda is prepared to host the headquarters of a new African Development Bank, fully capitalized by African nations, designed to fund African development without external conditionality. The session that was supposed to last one day extended to 3. By the end, 34 African nations had signed the Addis Ababa Declaration on African Sovereignty, committing to non-cooperation with sanctions against fellow African states, and to concrete steps toward economic integration. The Western diplomats watching from their embassies across Africa couldn't believe what they were witnessing. The sanctions designed to isolate Traoré had created exactly the opposite effect: the most unified African response to Western pressure since the independence movements of the 1960s. In Washington, Ambassador Richardson received an encrypted cable from the State Department's Africa desk that would keep him awake all night. The Traoré sanctions have backfired completely. We're facing coordinated African resistance on a scale we haven't seen in decades. Recommend immediate reassessment of strategy. The Great Assembly Hall of the African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa had never witnessed anything quite like this. Constructed with soaring ceilings and walls decorated with art from across the continent, the space was designed to inspire continental unity. Today, it would host the speech that would be remembered as the moment Africa finally found its voice. Ibrahim Traoré walked to the podium with the measured steps of a man who understood he was about to make history. Behind him sat the largest gathering of African leaders in decades, their faces reflecting a mixture of determination and excitement that comes with witnessing a transformational moment. The global media had finally caught up to the story. CNN, BBC France 24, and Al Jazeera had crews positioned around the hall, their correspondents struggling to explain to their audiences how quickly the narrative had shifted from isolating one troublesome leader to confronting unified African resistance. "Brothers and sisters," Traoré began, his voice carrying clearly through the advanced sound system. "We gather today not as individual nations begging for international acceptance, but as a continent demanding the respect we have earned through our resources, our humanity, and our dignity." The applause was immediate and sustained, but Traoré raised his hand for silence. He had more to say. For 60 years since independence, we have accepted a fiction, that we are free. We have waved our flags, sung our anthems, and celebrated our sovereignty while our resources flow to foreign shores. Our young people migrate to foreign lands, and our policies require foreign approval. In the press gallery, veteran Africa correspondent Sarah Mitchell from the BBC found herself leaning forward, recognizing that she was witnessing something unprecedented. She had covered African politics for 2 decades, seen countless summits and declarations, but this felt different. The energy in the room was electric, charged with the possibility of real change. The sanctions imposed against Burkina Faso, Traoré continued, his voice growing stronger, were designed to send a message that African sovereignty exists only at the pleasure of our former colonial masters. Today, we send a different message, that our sovereignty is not conditional, not negotiable, and not subject to foreign approval. President Kagame, sitting in the front row, nodded approvingly. As one of Africa's most successful leaders, his support carried enormous weight, and his visible approval of Traoré's words signaled to other leaders that this wasn't just rhetoric. It was policy. Today, we announce the creation of the Africans Sovereignty Fund, Traoré declared, producing a document signed by 34 African heads of state, a pool of resources contributed by African nations to support any member state facing economic pressure for pursuing policies in their national interest. The announcement sent shockwaves through the diplomatic community. In essence, Africa was creating its own economic defense mechanism, making it much more difficult for outside powers to use economic pressure to influence African policies. But Traoré wasn't finished. We also announced the establishment of the Continental Trade Network, facilitating trade between African nations using African currencies and African financial institutions. No longer will trade between neighbors require approval from distant capitals or conversion through foreign currencies designed to extract value from African commerce. In the Western diplomatic boxes, Ambassador Richardson felt his hands growing cold as he realized the implications. This wasn't just defiance, it was the systematic construction of alternative systems that would reduce Western influence across the continent. "Finally," Traoré said, pausing for effect as he looked directly into the television cameras, broadcasting his words across Africa and around the world. "We announce the African Peace and Security Compact, African solutions to African problems, African forces securing African interests, African leadership addressing African challenges." The hall erupted in applause that lasted nearly 5 minutes. Delegates rose to their feet, many with tears in their eyes, as they witnessed what felt like the second independence of their continent. But the most powerful moment was yet to come. To those who thought sanctions would isolate Burkina Faso, Traoré said, his voice now carrying the quiet confidence of a man who held winning cards, I say this: you have instead isolated yourselves from a continent that is finally ready to chart its own course. You can choose to engage with us as equals, or you can watch as we build the future without you. The speech concluded with Traoré reading the names of all 34 nations that had signed the Addis Ababa Declaration, each receiving thunderous applause from the assembly. As each name was called, the camera panned to show the respective head of state or representative, creating a visual representation of continental unity that would be replayed on news broadcasts around the world. In Paris, President Macron's advisors were in emergency session, trying to calculate how much influence France had just lost across Francophone Africa. In Washington, the State Department was fielding calls from mining companies, oil corporations, and defense contractors suddenly concerned about their African operations. The tables had indeed turned. What began as a calculated punishment had become the catalyst for African empowerment on a scale not seen since the independence movements of the 1960s. As Traoré left the podium to sustained ovation, he caught the eye of President Ramaphosa, who mouthed a single word that captured the moment perfectly. Finally, the young president from Burkina Faso had not just survived international isolation. He had transformed it into continental liberation. The sanctions designed to weaken one man had instead awakened an entire continent, and the world would never be the same. In the press conference that followed, a journalist from France 24 asked the question that everyone was thinking, Mr. President, what message do you have for the international community that imposed these sanctions? Traoré's response was simple but profound. Thank you. You gave us exactly what we needed. A reason to finally come together. What we've witnessed in this extraordinary story represents more than just a diplomatic miscalculation. It's a fundamental shift in global power dynamics that will shape international relations for generations to come. The United Nations sanctions, designed to isolate Ibrahim Traoré, instead created the very African unity that Western powers had worked for decades to prevent. What do you think about this incredible turn of events? Did the UN underestimate African unity, or was this continental awakening inevitable? Was it the arrogance of assuming Africa would remain divided, or simply a miscalculation of how much frustration had been building across the continent? Share your thoughts in the comments below.
Yes, guys, share your thoughts in the comments below. But those sequence of questions he asked at the end are very good questions that we as a people in Africa need to start finding answers to. Did they underestimate it? Are they succeeding because we're easily bribed? And a slew of questions that may be related. The answer, my friends, is blowing in the wind. The answer is blowing in the wind. Ladies and gentlemen, once again, this is Fred Wanko coming to you from our studios in Chicago with another edition of Bold Talk on Allen TV. But until next time, I hope I'm not living in a dream world. And if I am, I hope that someday you'll join us so that we can make Africa a better place. And until next time, good night and God bless.
Let's go.